Hey folks, my name is Terry, and in this video we're going to do a basic carb clean on a Honda CB750KZ. Now this is an old bike, it needs lots of work, so it'll be a series of videos as I go through each bit. But this is just a carb clean, how to take it off, how to do a basic clean, how to put it back together. Now carb cleaning is pretty straightforward, but what makes it difficult is getting everything out of the way, getting them off the bike and getting them back on again. So we'll start with the seat, we just open it up with a key, and then there's just one nut and bolt to undo, and then we can take the whole thing off its hinge and get it out of the way. Now you just pull the side panels off. You don't need a screwdriver for this, they're just spigots that go into holes. I've got a screwdriver because I was initially confused by the screw head on the outside of this panel, which is to do with a repair made by a previous owner, which we'll have to tidy up later. I'm going to disconnect and remove the battery, and that will create a little bit more space to move the airbox backwards and give some room for the carbs. When you do this, always, for a negative earth bike, which is most modern bikes and even some old Japanese ones, disconnect the negative terminal first and pull it out of the way, and then disconnect the positive terminal. When you put it back together, do the reverse, put the positive on first and then the negative last. If you don't do this and you do it the wrong way around and you accidentally touch the live, the red, against any part of the frame, then you will create a big spark and you may damage the electrics. The battery is held in its compartment by this little gate thing, so just undo the bolt at the end, open the gate and pull it out. And you notice when I do that, it's not a sealed battery, it's an old-fashioned one, and it's got a vent line going down, so that needs to come out with the battery too if you've got an old battery. Fuel tank off next, which is really simple because there's no electric pumps or fuel gauge wiring or anything like that to consider. It's just a simple gravity-fed tank. So we'll start by undoing the bolt which secures the tank just forward of the seat. Then put a bit of wood underneath the back. That will create space for you to get into the hose which goes into the petcock, and move the metal clip over with pliers, and then get a big flat-bladed screwdriver. Just push the hose off. As you do that, it's nice to have a little bit of cloth there in case a little bit comes out. You'll see that the fuel valve is in the off position. That's sort of the 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock position. That can be a bit confusing on these old bikes. Now the tank's just held on by a lug either side of the main crossbar, so wiggle it off and backwards and then put it somewhere safe, resting it in such a way that there's no weight on the petcock. With that done, have a quick look at the fuel line, and you can see here that it goes into this inline fuel filter and is held on with 2 zip ties. This is very bad practice. We're asking for a leak. I will replace that when we put it all back together. Next, I'm going to remove the clutch cable. I'll start with the little nut underneath the pivot. Once that's undone, you can take a big screwdriver and undo the shaft that holds the lever and about which it rotates. When that comes out, the lever will be free, and when you pull it out of its housing, then you'll be able to disconnect the cable where it goes into the lever. Now you could remove the carbs by leaving the clutch cable in place, but I prefer to remove it. It only takes a few seconds and it does get in the way a little bit. Now here at the clutch end of the bike, you can see that the cable goes into a little housing. Just undo the nuts that hold it in there, and then you'll be able to move the whole arrangement out of its bracket. And with that done, then you can just disconnect the lug from the actuating mechanism which goes into the clutch itself. Now, noting carefully which way it's routed so we can put it back the right way later, we'll remove the clutch cable from the bike and then we can inspect and oil it, and that's a bit of a bonus. Next, we're going to drain the carbs. This is not optional. You get covered in fuel if you don't do this. So at the base of each float bowl is a little flat-headed screw. Undo it. Make sure you've got something to catch the fuel in. Strictly speaking, there should be vent hoses on each of these, but they were lost a long time ago on this bike, it seems. But I connect one for when I'm doing the inner carb float bowls. The arrow here indicates the bolt on top of the airbox, which you need to loosen so we can move it rearwards, and that will create space for us. Now let's undo the 4 bolts that hold the airbox onto the back of the carb. You access 2 from each side. No need to remove them, just loosen them so they swivel around. And with that done, we'll just take hold of the airbox and just pull it rearwards off the carburetor. Now we undo the 4 clamps that go from the carburetor into the inlet manifolds, accessing 2 from each side, just like we did with the airbox clamps. And again, leave those clamps on, just get them loose so they rotate, they won't go anywhere. Once that's done, will take hold of the whole of the carburetor, and if you rotate it downwards it'll soon come off. Now it's in there pretty tight, so what we're going to do is just kind of wiggle it between the airbox and the engine block over to the right hand side of the bike as the rider looks at it, so that we can disconnect the cables. And we'll do the throttle cables first. There are two. The first one, which is the one towards the front of the bike, I've already undone. Sorry I didn't film that, but it's so easy. It's easy to get to, and that's the one that closes the throttle. The one you see me undoing the nut on now, this is the one that opens the throttle. It's a little bit more difficult. So we'll undo the nut that holds the cable to the bracket. And then I'm just going to get a little bit of plastic, and I'm going to open the throttle by turning the whole mechanism towards the front of the bike and jam this bit of plastic in it. It's just a bit of piping connector. And this just moves the whole lug arrangement up so it's easier to get at and easier to disconnect. Here's a view from the top of the bike so you can see where the cable goes into its little housing. And now, provided you've jammed open the throttle and you've taken the cable out of its little bracket at the top of the carb, you should just be able to get in there with something hook shaped. To pick is ideal, and just loop that around the cable and pull it out of its housing. Simples. Choke cable next. This is a lot more straightforward. You've just got a little bracket which you have to access from the left side of the bike. Undo the screw which retains the cable, and once that's undone you'll be able to just unhook the choke from its retaining bracket going into the carb. Okay, let's get into the carbs then. First thing, I'll print out the appropriate pages from the user manual, easily available online, and I've ordered a carb kit so we can replace anything that goes wrong. Next, I'm going to put the carbs into a tray and clean the outside, because when you open something up, anything dirty on the outside tends to get inside anyway. Now, I'm just doing a basic clean on these carbs because they're working fine. I'm not going to split them. First thing I'm going to do is take off the vacuum cylinders, and because these screws are easy to round off and they're a pain in the arse to replace, I'm going to put a bit of heat on them, spray it with some WD-40, other penetrants are available, and then once that's done it should be much easier to get the screws off without any risk of rounding them off. So here I am taking off number 3 vacuum cylinder. I didn't film number 1 because I was slow. By the time I got onto the third one I'm a bit quicker so I don't bore you to death. So off comes the cylinder cover, and clean up that because the cylinder itself slides up and down inside that. It needs to be free. Now I put a diagram up here so that you can see the bits that I'm going to work on. So once that's clean, we'll go back to the mechanism and remove the spring. Underneath the spring on the end of the needle there's a full open stopper, which is a little plastic piece. If that won't come off with finger pressure, then just use a pair of pliers and gently nip it off. And then get into the cavity underneath where the stopper was with a screwdriver and undo the needle set screw. Once you've undone that, the needle will just fall out, but of course be careful that you don't damage it as it comes out. I'm putting it into a metal tray here, magnetic tray, which catches all the bits. Now I'll clean the vacuum cylinder with some carb cleaner and some paper, taking extra care that the widest bit of the diameter there, which is what slides up and down inside the cylinder, is nice and clean. And this is very bad practice. If you're going to use carb cleaner, it should be in a well ventilated space. But it was absolutely freezing outside and I was being a bit lazy. Now I'm getting back to the main body of the carb, and there's a little plastic cover to remove once I've given it a quick clean. And when we do that, we'll be able to get access to the jets, and we need to get some carb cleaner in here and then blow them through with compressed air. Again, I've put a diagram up here so you can see what we're going for. Once that's done, we'll replace the little plastic covers and start to reassemble the vacuum cylinder. And we'll do this process with each of the carbs in turn, rinse and repeat. Before we put the needle back in, have a quick look, make sure it's not bent or chipped. Drop everything in the reverse order in which you put it in, screw it down, put the full stop cap on it, and then carefully put it back into the carb so the needle goes down through the orifice in the centre. And you'll notice that the cylinder has a groove in one side, so it can only go in one orientation, you can't get it wrong. Once it's back in, it's back on with the cover and the 2 screws, and it's exactly the same procedure for each of the other carbs. Onto the float bowls now. These have 3 screws, And again, as with the vacuum covers, if you sense that they're all gunked up, a little bit of heat and a little bit of penetrating oil will save you chewing up the heads. Now to remove the float, this is held on by a little axle which goes in through this tube which is part of the carb here. As I pull this away, the float comes free, and also the valve which is sort of swinging away there will probably drop off, so make sure you pick that up and inspect all the parts. What I mean by inspect is that when you look at the float, make sure that there are no holes in it and it's going to float effectively, and look at the valve and make sure that there's no chips or pits or damage to that valve and the valve seat where it goes into the carb, because if that doesn't seal properly, it won't stop the fuel going into the float bowl, and that's when you get an overflow and you get fuel pouring out the bottom of your carb. If anything isn't 100% perfect, just replace it with a new item from the carb kit. Now at this point we'll get into the jets and we'll unscrew the primary and the secondary jets and take off the slow jet plug, and then we will squirt carb cleaner into all of them and then blow compressed air through. There's a diagram so you can see what we're doing. Be a little bit careful as you do this, because as you blow the compressed air through and the carb cleaner starts to work its way around, it'll go out through various channels and it'll come back at you, usually straight up your nose or into your eye from a direction you didn't expect. So just stay back a little bit and perhaps wear protective glasses if you want. This one down the bottom here is called the pilot screw, and this takes a little bit more care. So before you remove it, put a screwdriver on it and just count how many turns it takes to screw it all the way in. Then make a note of that and then unscrew it and clean it. And then when you put it back in, wind it all the way in and then out by the number of turns that you counted. So the basic idea is you're going to leave it in exactly the same state as when you removed it. Now all of these jets that you're taking out, and I'm popping into my little magnetic tray here, you're going to have to clean those as well with carb cleaner and compressed air. And there's a little tool you can get which is dead cheap on eBay or any motor factors to help you go through the little holes with some tiny bits of wire. But if you're going to do that, just be ever so careful that you don't make the holes any wider, because the metal is usually brass and it's pretty soft. Inside the pilot screw cavity there's a little spring. Just remove that before you blow it through or it might fly everywhere. And in addition to cleaning all the little fuel passages in there, you also need to clean the seal where the float bowl cover goes on and meets its rubber seal. Make sure that's completely flat, there's no residue on there. You can see on the end of my compressor nozzle I've got a little rubber tip, and that helps me to press it right up against the cavities to get a good seal and blow things through. You can see how quickly that vapour blasts back at your face. Now if you don't have a compressor, it's not a big deal. You can go to Screwfix or anywhere like that and you can buy cans of compressed air with a nice little plastic straw, and they're just as good for getting into the smaller spaces. In some cases they're even better than a big old noisy compressor. And here you can see me getting busy with my little tool to go in at those holes. Now I can't emphasize enough, you're only trying to remove fuel residue. It's not hard, so just a very gentle press with something which is smaller than the hole. You'll get some very strange fueling issues if you grind it any bigger than it needs to be. This is quite an important bit, so I'll run this at normal speed, not speeded up. We're going to put the float bowl back on. So we pick up the float bowl and we get the valve, and the valve just hangs over a little bit of wire close to where the axle will go on the float bowl. Once that's hanging there, we bring it back to the main carb body and we put the valve down into its seat. Before you do that, have a look down into the seat and make sure it's absolutely crystal clear in there. One tiny little speck of dirt on that seat will prevent it sealing properly and will give you a carb overflow. Once it's on there, we get the little axle, push it through the two stanchions, one either side. Make sure there's none of the axle sticking out either side, and then that's the float bowl in there and attached. If you suspect any sort of overfueling overflow issues, you can put the carb vertically upwards and measure it, and the manual will tell you how far out it should stick. But there are no problems indicated with this bike in terms of overflowing. It's just running slightly rough. So I'm happy with that. And next we're going to put the float bowl back on. Now, normal circumstances I would have changed the rubber seal that goes on there, but the carb kit I got was for completely a different bike. The supplier really let me down here. And the seals themselves on this one were really good, so I'm happy to put them back on and give them a try. And actually they were absolutely fine, there were no leaks at all. But if you are putting a new seal on the float bowl, it's a good idea when you put it on just to put a tiny little dab of silicone grease on one or two spots, and that will help to hold it on, make sure it seats properly. Right, in we go with the screws, screw it all in, and it should be good. Now you might find that when you put the carbs back on and you turn the fuel on, if you do get a leak from one of the float bowls, give it a tap with the base of a screwdriver handle, and that might stop it, rather than instantly thinking that you've done something wrong and you need to take the whole thing off. It might just need a tap. Before refitting the carbs, I cleaned the inlet manifold rubbers with a bit of WD-40 and paper towel. I gently twist the throttle while I'm looking at the cables, and when you advance the throttle, i.e. when you put the power on, the wire that moves into the cable, that's the one that needs to go towards the back. You can make life a lot easier for yourself if you heat up the inlet manifold rubbers. I'm using a heat gun, but a hairdryer will be just as good, and this will soften the rubber, make the carb easier to fit. Now bring the carbs over to the bike, and holding them vertically upwards, I'm going to fit the throttle cable towards the front first, because that's the easier one to get on. And then once that one's on, we will fit the one that goes to the back, which is a little bit more fiddly. And again, if you can jam open the accelerator here by turning the mechanism and putting something in it, or hold it with your finger, that makes life a little bit easier. So once the end of the cables are onto the round bit which operates the throttle, we'll put the cables themselves into the cable holders and then just nip them up so that they are nice and firm and don't wiggle about. Then we'll hook the end of the choke cable over its little lug and then put the cable into the bracket at the top and nip that up so it holds it firm as well. And that's all the cables reconnected once we've done that. Now we'll push the carbs back into position between the airbox and the cylinder head. And as we do that, you'll find this is the bit which can be a little bit frustrating, because as you push them onto the rubber manifold joints there, you go into the other side and you push it, and as it goes in one side, it slips out the other. And you come back and it just keeps falling off. So here is a way of doing it which I found quite straightforward and which should reduce the frustration. So what I've done is I've daisy chained some zip ties together and put them around between the carb and the cylinder head, ready to tighten. And I use one of those cheap plastic clamps that you can get from B&Q or any hardware store, which have got nice soft rubber jaws, and I use them to squeeze the carburetor up against the engine. Once that's in and I know it's tight as far as it will go, then I'll tighten the zip ties on that side, and then I can switch to the other side of the bike and push the carburetor on and tighten the manifolds, knowing that nothing's going to move on the side that's got the clamp. Then I come back to the side with the clamp and tighten up the manifolds there as well. So simple. Once we're finished, we'll just use a pair of snips to get rid of the zip ties and take the clamp off, and everything's up nice and snug. Now we'll reconnect the airbox. This is much easier than getting the carb onto the cylinder head. There's just a lot more tolerance in here, and the consequences of not getting it right aren't as bad. If you're not on the cylinder head properly at the inlets, then you'll find that when you operate the accelerator, the revs will go up like a rocket and down like a feather, and you'll have more revs than you think. And that's a classic sign of an air leak, and it won't idle properly either. Here, this is just the feed going into the carbs, and it's less of an issue. So we're tightening all of these things up. So 2 screws each side, shoving it forward gently, and then once we've done all of the covers on the rubber seals, we'll go to the top of the airbox, to that screw, push the airbox forward so it's held under a little bit of tension, and then we'll tighten that up, and then that's everything snugged up and ready to go. Now you remember we had this rather shabby inline filter which you can see on the bench there, and that was fastened with zip ties. So we're going to sort that out. I've got a new length of pipe here, I'm just warming it up. I've got a new filter, that's the one that's just sort of rolling around up against the old one, and we'll fit this. Now while you're watching me do this, I'll just explain a few things that I didn't do with the carb clean, which you'll find that some other people will do, or indeed I would do in different circumstances. So number one, I didn't split the carbs. That's because the bike's not been sitting unused for a long time. This is basically a reasonably well functioning bike that's been running a little bit rough, and what we really need to do is do the shims and address a compression issue. But as we had the carbs off, we cleaned them anyway. Now, some CB750s have an accelerator pump. This particular one doesn't, and that's why you didn't see me doing that. Now we'll crimp the new length of hose and the inline filter onto the old bit, which was already on the carb. I favour these double ear clamps, it's easy for me to say, and this special tool here which puts them together. Only costs a few quid, and it gives you a really secure leak-proof joint. Much, much better than using a removable clamp, I think. I think you should only really have one removable clamp, and that's where it goes into the petrol cock on the fuel tank. Everything else should be pretty permanent. I'll put the fuel tank back on. Now, where at the front it goes onto those two rubber lugs, it can be a bit stiff, so it does no harm to put a WD-40 on there to ease it on. Okay, then we slip the pipe onto the petrol cock, which I forgot to film, sorry about that, and then put the tank back down and tighten up the nut at the back so it won't move. Then pop the battery back in and reconnect it. Remember, red lead first, black lead second. Then we'll put on the side panels, reconnect the seat, and we're all done. Well, I hope you enjoyed that and you found it of some use. This is one of a series of videos which I'll be posting as I go through the restoration of this bike. And that will include some quite involved work like getting the engine out, doing the valve shims and getting the head off as well, and putting a new exhaust and other things too. So lots to come. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.